Today on the Playbook Podcast, the latest fallout from the killing of Charlie Kirk and what this means about the present moment in U.S. politics. Hello, I'm Adam Wren.
And I'm Megan Messerly. It's Friday, September 12th.
And this is the Playbook Podcast. Let's get right to what's driving the day. Megan, we are still experiencing the shockwaves from Charlie Kirk's death. What we know when we're recording as of late Thursday night is that essentially the public safety officials in Utah and the FBI have what they are saying is, quote, no idea about who did this. We are still monitoring this. We know that President Donald Trump awarded posthumously the Medal of Freedom to Charlie Kirk. We know that the FBI has received the most digital tips since the Boston Marathon bombing. We're seeing that many lawmakers, including AOC, are canceling their campaign events. We're seeing threats to historically Black colleges and universities. And we're hearing Megan, President Donald Trump himself saying, quote, we have to beat the hell, end quote, out of, quote, radical left lunatics, end quote, after Charlie Kirk's killing. Megan, what do you make of all of this? You're out this morning with some fresh reporting about how Charlie Kirk influenced a number of White House officials. What do you make of this moment? One of the MAGA movement's own stars, own leaders, has been killed, but the Trump administration is really struggling to find the person who did this.
They really are. And I think that really just makes the grieving process so much harder for those who knew Charlie Kirk well. I spent the whole day yesterday pretty much talking to folks in the White House, folks outside the White House, all the way from people who knew Charlie very well and were close friends to people who didn't know him personally or had only met him in passing, but just spoke of the influence that he had on them. Obviously, we know that Charlie Kirk was a firebrand. He said controversial things, divisive things at times, but I think the big takeaway here is just whether or not you agreed with Charlie Kirk, just the disbelief that someone was out speaking their mind in this sort of public forum and was shot. And again, we don't know the motive. We don't know why. I think folks are just grappling with this disbelief and wanting answers, which we don't have right now from the FBI or from law enforcement in Utah, which is really tricky and is going to be a challenge for FBI Director Kash Patel, who's now on the ground in Utah.
Yeah, and of course, this takes place at a moment of increasing political violence on both sides. Just a few months ago, we saw two Democratic Minnesota lawmakers gunned down. One of them died. President Trump himself faced two assassination attempts last year. Leaders seem to broadly agree that it's a significant problem across the United States right now. I thought it was interesting, Megan, when the president was on the South Lawn of the White House yesterday as he was headed to New York City to a New York Yankees game. He was responding to a reporter who asked what his message was to conservatives who feel targeted by, quote, radical groups, end quote. And he said that he would urge his supporters to follow a nonviolent path. In response to the shooting, he said Charlie Kirk was an advocate of nonviolence, and also that that's the way that he would like to see people respond. But we've also seen sort of an uneven tone from President Trump on this. He's talked about the radical left posing a threat to the right. A number of Democratic lawmakers, specifically Democratic Governor of Pennsylvania Josh Shapiro, last night took issue with Trump's Oval Office remarks. Of course, Shapiro was the target of an arson attempt as his family slept in the Pennsylvania governor's mansion. So what do you make, Megan, of the president's response here overall?
It's really interesting. To me, it's sort of emblematic, I think, of how conservatives in general are grappling with all of this. I'm sure you've spent a lot of time scrolling through X, scrolling through Truth Social, and just looking at how folks are reacting to this, in addition to my own conversations, and just this real mix of, I think, this visceral anger, which is what you hear from the president, and sort of wanting to, what he said, quote, beat the hell out of the folks who did this. At the same time, I think you see this other chorus of voices, including, I'll say, from some younger Gen Z folks as well, saying Charlie was all about the debate and the discourse. And even if you thought his remarks were incendiary, he was never calling for folks to resort to violence, obviously. And so I think what we're seeing now from the president is sort of that tension between, do you move forward in a nonviolent way? But at the same time, what do you do with all that anger and that frustration? And again, sort of just the visceral knee jerk reaction from so many folks, which is so real. And, it's really early to be talking about all of this, but we could see some movements from the White House or other policy changes as a result of this. Like, we don't know what that's going to be because I don't think people are in a place to really figure all of that out right now still. But this is really just the beginning. And so I think between these two poles is where I see the president, but that's kind of where I see the movement as well right now, just because all of this is still so fresh.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right, Megan. And I think let's allow the fact that it's not even 48 hours into
Yeah.
this. There's not even been a memorial service
No.
for Charlie Kirk here. And so emotions are clearly raw here. And Trump, it's not uncharacteristic for him to talk about the radical left or speak frankly in what he might call righteous anger. And so that's all unfolding here. But what I'm most interested in right now is someone like Kash Patel. Our colleague Erica Orden has a great piece up on the website this morning looking at how he really has fumbled this in a significant way. And that's not according to us as commentators, it's according to MAGA leaders. People are upset with him. People like Laura Ingraham of Fox. He initially announced that they had a suspect in custody. And last night we saw him at a press conference in Utah that really didn't break news. Really didn't move the meter. And it's unclear where this investigation is at, how close they are. And so I'm curious what you make of Cash at this moment.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really, really challenging position. And I think we've seen this through Cash heading up the FBI, through Pam Bondi and her role as Attorney General, just each of them grappling with the job and the complications that come with the job. In something like this, you want to be able to find the suspect right away, begin the process of putting them on trial and bringing them to justice and letting the process work itself out. But reality is complicated. It's hard to find these people. What we saw last night was this press conference in Utah where the law enforcement officials in Utah and the FBI were very clearly just trying to get the message out and get the visuals out to get the public's help in getting more leads. I mean, we talked about the massive number of tips that the FBI has gotten, and still they're clearly searching for more, saying this is what his shirt looked like and he was wearing Converse and he jumped off of this building, just like a lot of these very specifics and soliciting the public's help. And I think that just underscores how much it seems like law enforcement doesn't know right now. And again, that in of itself is not unusual. Sometimes folks are caught right away. Sometimes it takes several days. If folks remember in the case of Luigi Mangione, it took several days before he was identified at a McDonald's. So not unusual that we don't know, but there's obviously just a lot of political pressure, again, just because of how important Charlie Kirk was to the conservative movement. And the fact that you have someone like Kash Patel running the FBI, people want answers and they want them now, which I think is sort of just like a natural reaction in these kind of situations. But his initial coming out and saying, we found the person, I think is what really landed him in some trouble with the movement writ large and then having to walk that back. So we'll see where all this goes from here and how long of a leash or not some of these prominent leaders give him.
Yeah, and we should be clear that this is a fast developing story and new developments could emerge at any moment. But more broadly, I'm fascinated. We've talked about the demand side hunger for leads and for some conclusions about who did this. But there's also, Megan, I've noticed a hunger among people for some sort of larger than life leader to forge or call us to sort of our better angels, to call us to unity. And I have a new story out this morning looking at how because of our fractured media environment, because of declining religious and civic involvement, there really is no broadly trusted civic or religious or political leader who can speak to our better angels. President Trump has never made false entrees that he's the kind of person who can unite everybody. He's been his true, authentic self. But I'm curious, Megan, what you make of that gap right now. We've heard some top Catholic bishops mourn the loss of Charlie Kirk. A lot of evangelical leaders are hailing him as something of a martyr, but there's no sort of, Reverend Billy Graham who can speak to broad swaths of the country in a way that brings them some kind of solace. I'm curious what you make of that.
It just feels like we're in such a different era from the days where you had these unifying figures, whether it was a Billy Graham or a president or something like that, right? It just speaks to how divided our nation is. I think there are a few figures out there like Pope Leo, right, who has managed to appeal to both Catholics on both the right and the left, someone like that who has a little bit of appeal across the spectrum. But in general, it's really hard. There just aren't a lot of figures like that. We even see people in pop culture get politicized as being on the right or the left. I mean, there's just not one unifying force these days. And so I think it's just emblematic of the culture and what we're seeing and the deep political divisions. But at the same time, I just think about who these folks who just looked so much up to Charlie Kirk, who they're looking to in this moment, right? Those folks need someone to sort of unite them and get them through this period. And I don't know that there's someone like that either, to say nothing of the overarching countrywide figure. And that just speaks to how complicated and really difficult of a moment that we're in right now.
Well, Megan, even though this is a story that's blotting out the political sun, we have seen developments over the last 24 hours on two other key stories. And that's one, President Donald Trump's latest comments on Russia and Poland, and also the latest on Lisa Cook. The Trump administration on Thursday asked a federal appeals court to allow it to move ahead with firing Cook from the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors in order to block her from taking part in the central bank's meeting on interest rates next week. What are the next shoes to drop on these two storylines?
Yeah, I mean, this is, to your point, the world is sort of marching on even as folks are processing this. We'll have to see what comes next in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine saga. Obviously, European leaders very concerned by this. The president, in his remarks last night, indicated he wasn't pleased with this, but said maybe it was a mistake. But we obviously know right now that the president is just in a very tense, frustrated situation with Russian President Vladimir Putin right now. So we'll have to see what comes of this next week. On Lisa Cook, I mean, this is just the really big story that we're watching, right? The economy is just so important, not just to folks' everyday lives, but just to the president and his political legacy and the midterm elections. The president has been pushing for this, for the Fed to cut interest rates now for months. And if folks remember, this is what got us to this point with the president trying to fire Lisa Cook. And so all of this is coming to a head with the president now appealing and trying to get permission to be able to fire her ahead of the Fed's meeting, which begins Tuesday. And so we're really running out of time here for there to be some sort of resolution. And all of this is just complicated by, there were some inflation numbers that came out yesterday that were a little bit worse than expected. If folks remember, there was this jobs report that came out that made it seem like all but certain the Fed was going to lower interest rates. This inflation report that came out puts that a little bit into question, though the folks I've talked to still think that that rate cut is likely. But it's a really complicated economic situation that the administration is navigating and that the Fed is going to have to navigate too, even against this backdrop of litigation. And there's just so much happening in the world right now on top of everything that folks are grappling with here in Washington.
And we'll leave it right there for today. That's all for today's show, but we have much more news and analysis in today's Playbook newsletter, which you can find at politico.com/playbook. Megan, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Adam.